It was just a photo of mother and daughter. But notice the girl's hand reveals a shocking truth. The antique shop on Decatur Street in New Orleans had seen better days. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that filtered through grimy windows, illuminating rows of forgotten objects that once meant everything to someone. Margaret Hayes, a historical preservation specialist, wasn't looking for anything in particular that Thursday afternoon in March. She had stopped in during a lunch break, drawn by a handwritten sign advertising estate sale items from local families. The shop owner, an elderly man named Mr. Thibodeau, nodded absently as Margaret moved through the cramped aisles. She had almost reached the back of the store when something caught her eye. A small wooden box tucked between a stack of old magazines and a tarnished silver picture frame. Inside the box, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a photograph. Margaret carefully lifted it into the light. The image showed an African-American woman and a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. They were dressed in simple but clean clothing, the woman in a dark dress with a white collar, the girl in a lighter-colored dress with small buttons down the front. The photograph appeared to be from around 1905, judging by the clothing style and the sepia tone typical of that era. What struck Margaret immediately was the woman's expression. Her face held a profound sadness that seemed to transcend the formal stiffness common in early 20th century photography. Her hand rested protectively on the girl's shoulder, but there was something about the gesture that felt more like an attempt to hold on to something slipping away than a casual maternal touch. The girl sat perfectly still, her face turned slightly toward the camera. Her eyes were open, but there was something unusual about them. A flatness, an absence of the spark that even the most solemn children of that era typically showed in photographs. Margaret turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded ink, were only 2 words. Emily, 1904. She studied the image more carefully, her trained eye picking up details she had missed at first glance. The girl's posture was too perfect, too unnaturally rigid. Her hands, folded in her lap, seemed positioned rather than resting naturally. And then Margaret noticed something that made her breath catch. The girl's left hand appeared slightly blurred, as if someone had tried to hold it in place during the long exposure time required for photographs of that era. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. She had seen photographs like this before in her research, though never one that felt quite so intimate, so heartbreaking. She approached Mr. Thibodeau at the counter. "This photograph," she said quietly. "Where did it come from?" Mr. Thibodeau adjusted his glasses and squinted at the photograph Margaret held. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he took it from her, and for a moment a flicker of recognition crossed his face before settling back into the practiced neutrality of someone who had spent decades buying and selling other people's memories. That came in about 2 weeks ago," he said, his Louisiana accent thick and slow like molasses. "Part of an estate clearance from a house over in Trem. Old Creole family. The descendants were moving away, selling everything. Most of it was just everyday items, furniture, dishes, books, but there were some personal effects too. This was in a trunk in the attic." Margaret felt a chill despite the warmth of the afternoon. Tremé was one of the oldest African-American neighborhoods in the United States, with roots stretching back to the early 1800s. If this photograph had been preserved there for over a century, it might be possible to trace its origins. "Did they mention anything about the people in the photograph?" Margaret asked. "No, ma'am. They didn't seem to know much about the older items. Said their grandmother had kept a lot of things from previous generations, but she'd passed 5 years ago, and nobody had gone through it all until now." He paused, studying Margaret's face. "You thinking of buying it?" "Yes," Margaret said without hesitation. "How much?" $20. Margaret paid and carefully tucked the photograph into her bag. Back at her office at the Louisiana Historical Society, she set up her workspace with the precision of someone about to perform surgery. She had specialized lighting, a high-resolution scanner, and software that could enhance and analyze old photographs. This was more than just curiosity now. Something about the image had taken hold of her. She scanned the photograph at the highest resolution and pulled up the image on her computer screen. Zooming in, she began to examine every detail methodically. The woman's face showed signs of recent tears, slight puffiness around the eyes, a tightness in her jaw. The background was simple, likely a photographer's studio with a painted backdrop showing a modest interior scene. Then Margaret focused on the girl's hands. The right hand appeared normal, resting atop the left, but the left hand, the one that had caught her attention in the shop, showed clear signs of being held in position. As she enhanced the image, she could see what appeared to be a thin wire or stand beneath the girl's arm, partially hidden by the fabric of her dress. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her suspicions confirmed. This was a post-mortem photograph, a practice that had been common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly among families who couldn't afford portraits during their children's lifetimes. When a child died, grieving parents would hire a photographer to create one final image, often posing the deceased child as if they were merely sleeping or sitting peacefully. The realization settled over Margaret like a heavy blanket. She had studied postmortem photography extensively during her graduate work, but academic knowledge couldn't prepare her for the emotional weight of holding such an intimate moment of grief in her hands. This wasn't just a historical artifact. It was a mother's last chance to have something tangible of her daughter, a desperate attempt to freeze a moment before the finality of burial made the loss irreversible. Margaret began researching the practice more deeply, specifically in New Orleans during the early 1900s. The city had been a melting pot of cultures, and photographic studios had served all communities, though African American families often faced limited options and higher prices. For a poor black family in 1904, commissioning even a post-mortem photograph would have represented a significant financial sacrifice. She pulled out several reference books and began cross-referencing photographic studios that had operated in New Orleans during that period. The style of the backdrop, the lighting, and the mounting of the photograph itself provided clues. The cardstock on which the photo was mounted bore no photographer's mark, which was unusual. Most studios proudly stamped their name and address on the backing. This suggested either a very small operation or perhaps a photographer who served primarily African American clients in an era when such work might not have been openly advertised. Margaret made notes to visit the New Orleans Public Library's archives the following day. They had an extensive collection of city directories from that period. As evening approached, Margaret couldn't stop looking at the photograph. The mother's face haunted her. There was something in her eyes, not just grief, but a fierce determination. This woman had wanted this photograph made. She had dressed her daughter carefully, arranged her just so, and sat beside her for what must have been an excruciating length of time while the photographer worked. Margaret noticed other details now. The woman wore a small brooch at her collar, simple, likely not valuable, but pinned with care. The girl's dress, while plain, was spotless and pressed. Even in death, this mother had insisted on dignity for her child. The name Emily echoed in Margaret's mind. Just Emily, no last name, no date beyond the year 1904. It was so little to go on, yet Margaret felt compelled to find out more. This photograph had survived for over a century, preserved in an attic in Treme. Someone had cared enough to keep it, even when its original context had been lost. Margaret photographed the back of the image again, using different lighting angles. Sometimes old ink revealed more under specific conditions, but the writing remained stubbornly simple. Just those two elements, a name and a year. Friday morning arrived with typical New Orleans humidity, the air thick enough to wrap around you like a second skin. Margaret arrived at the New Orleans Public Library before it opened, clutching a folder with copies of the photograph and her preliminary notes. The Louisiana Division held one of the most comprehensive collections of local historical records in the South, and Margaret had spent countless hours here during previous research projects. The head archivist, James Winters, recognized her immediately. A retired professor with decades of experience, he had become Margaret's informal mentor since she had moved to New Orleans 3 years ago. "Margaret," he greeted her warmly. "You have that look. You found something." She showed him the photograph, explaining how she had discovered it and what she had determined so far. James studied the image carefully, his practiced eye taking in the same details Margaret had noted. "Post-mortem," he said quietly. "Poor child. And the mother, look at her face. She's holding herself together through sheer will." He turned the photograph over, examining the backing. "No studio mark. That's interesting. Let me show you something." He led Margaret to a section of the archives she hadn't explored before, a collection of business records and city directories from the early 20th century. He pulled several volumes from 1903 to 1906. African American photographers in New Orleans during this period weren't always listed in the main city directories, James explained, but they existed, serving their communities. Some left records in church bulletins, newspaper advertisements in black publications, or business licenses filed with the city. They spent the morning combing through records. Margaret found 3 photographers who had operated in or near Treme between 1903 and 1905. One name appeared most frequently, Arthur Beaumont, who had maintained a small studio on St. Philip Street. "Beaumont?" James said thoughtfully. "I've seen that name before. Give me a moment." He disappeared into the back archives and returned 20 minutes later with a slim folder. Inside were several documents related to Arthur Beaumont, a business license from 1898, a notice of studio closure from 1912, and, most intriguingly, a handwritten ledger page that appeared to list clients and services from 1904. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she examined the ledger. The entries were sparse, many with only first names or partial information. Then, about halfway down the page, she found it. "Emily, memorial portrait, Octon 14, October 14th, 1904. The date matched the year written on the photograph. "That's her," Margaret whispered. "It has to be." But there was no last name, no address, no other identifying information. Just Emily and the type of service provided. Memorial portrait, the gentle euphemism for photographing the dead. The October 14th, 1904 date gave Margaret a crucial starting point. If Emily had died shortly before the photograph was taken, there should be a death record. New Orleans had maintained death certificates since the late 1800s, though records for African American residents were sometimes incomplete or filed separately. Margaret spent the afternoon at the Louisiana State Archives, working through death records from September through November 1904. The task was tedious and heartbreaking. So many children had died in that era, from tuberculosis, influenza, accidents, and diseases that were now preventable. Each entry represented a family's tragedy, but Margaret was looking for one specific loss. She found 3 girls named Emily who had died during that time frame. The first was Emily Rousseau, age 12, too old based on the photograph. The second was Emily Martin, age 3, too young. The third was simply listed as Emily, colored, age approx. 7 and 8 years. Died October 11th, 1904. Margaret's breath caught. October 11th, just 3 days before the photograph was taken. The age matched, but the record was frustratingly sparse. Cause of death was listed as fever, a catch-all term that could have meant anything from typhoid to scarlet fever. No parents' names were recorded, no address, no additional details. This was common in records involving poor African-American families of that era. Children who died were sometimes registered with minimal information, especially if the family lacked resources or formal documentation. It was a stark reminder of how many lives had passed through history, leaving barely a trace. But Margaret had learned that absence of official records didn't mean absence of history. She needed to look elsewhere, in church records, in oral histories, in the memories preserved by the community itself. She reached out to several historical churches in Trem, asking if they had baptismal or burial records from 1904. St. Augustine Catholic Church, one of the oldest African-American Catholic churches in the nation, responded first. Their records were extensive, meticulously maintained by generations of priests who understood they were preserving not just religious sacraments, but the proof of their parishioners' very existence. The church archivist, Sister Marie, invited Margaret to visit the following Monday. "We have records going back to the 1840s, she said over the phone. "If this child was part of our parish, she'll be in our books." Margaret spent the weekend unable to think of much else. She had enlarged the photograph and pinned it to her office wall, studying it during breaks in her other work. The mother's face had become familiar now, as had Emily's peaceful expression, the expression of eternal sleep. Saint. Augustine Catholic Church stood on St. Claude Avenue, a testament to faith and resilience. Its walls had witnessed marriages and baptisms, funerals and festivals, through slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and into the modern era. Walking through its doors, on Monday morning, Margaret felt the weight of that history. Sister Marie met her in the church office, a small room lined with filing cabinets and shelves of leather-bound record books. The elderly nun had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and moved with the careful precision of someone who understood the fragility of old documents. "These books are treasures," Sister Marie said, pulling a volume marked 1903-1906 from a shelf. "They tell us who we were, who we are. Every name matters." They sat together at a wooden table, worn smooth by decades of use. Sister Marie opened the book to the burial records from October 1904. Her finger traced down the page, past names and dates until it stopped. "Here," she said soft. "Emily, October 13th, 1904. Margaret leaned forward. The entry read, "Emily, daughter of Ruth, age 7 years, died October 11th of fever. Buried October 13th, 1904. Plot 47, St. Louis Cemetery No. 2. Father unknown. Ruth." Emily's mother had a name now. "Is there a baptismal record?" Margaret asked, her voice tight with emotion. Sister Marie turned to an earlier section of the book. She ran her finger down the entries from 1897, then stopped. "Here. Emily, born June 3rd, 1897. Baptized June 20th, 1897. Mother, Ruth Williams. Father, not recorded. Williams. Ruth Williams and her daughter Emily. The father not being recorded was common," Sister Marie explained gently. "Sometimes the fathers had passed away. Sometimes they were absent. Sometimes it was—" She paused delicately. "Complicated. We recorded what the mothers told us." Margaret pulled out the photograph and showed it to Sister Marie. "This is them. This is Ruth and Emily." The nun studied the image, crossing herself quietly. "The poor woman. She lost her baby and still found the money for this photograph. That tells you everything about her love." "Is there anything else in the records about Ruth?" Margaret asked. "Did she stay in the parish? Is there a marriage record, other children?" Sister Marie turned pages carefully, scanning entries. Then she paused again. Oh my. She pointed to an entry from February 1905, just 4 months after Emily's death. "Ruth Williams, age 29 years, died February 3rd, 1905. Cause, grief and consumption. Buried February 5th, 1905. St. Louis Cemetery No. 2, Plot 47. The words hung in the air. Grief and consumption, tuberculosis, often called consumption, but the priest who had recorded the death had listed grief first. The notation of both Ruth and Emily being buried in Plot 47 meant they were together. Margaret knew that St. Louis Cemetery No. 2 was still an active historical cemetery, though many of its oldest sections had fallen into disrepair. The cemetery had been established in 1823 and served as the burial ground for many of New Orleans' African-American and Creole communities. That afternoon, Margaret obtained permission from the Archdiocese to visit the cemetery and search for the grave. The cemetery manager, Mr. Duchamp, met her at the gate with a map that was more holes than information. "Plot 47 would be in the old section," he said. leading her along crumbling paths past above-ground tombs in various states of decay. Many of the markers are gone now, stolen, weathered away, or just lost to time. They walked for 15 minutes, Mr. Duchamp consulting his map and occasionally checking plot numbers on the few marked graves they passed. Finally, he stopped in a section where the grass grew tall and wild. "Should be right around here," he said. "But I warn you, there's likely no marker left." Margaret began searching methodically, pushing aside vegetation, checking for any sign of a grave marker. Some plots had simple crosses, others had flat stones nearly buried in earth. Many had nothing at all. Then, in the shadow of a larger family tomb, she found it. A small, flat stone, cracked and heavily weathered. She knelt and carefully cleared away the growth around it. Letters were barely visible, worn by more than a century of rain and neglect. She used water from her bottle and a soft brush to clean the surface gently. Slowly, words emerged. Emily Williams, 1897, 1904. Ruth Williams, 1875, 1905. Mother and daughter reunited in heaven. Someone had cared enough to commission a marker, even a modest one. Someone had made sure their names were recorded, that their connection was preserved in stone even as it had been preserved in the photograph. Margaret sat back on her heels, tears streaming down her face. She had found them, not just their names in a book, but their actual resting place. Ruth had survived only 4 months after losing Emily. The grief had been too much, compounded by illness and likely by poverty and the harsh realities of being a single black woman in Jim Crow-era New Orleans. She photographed the marker from multiple angles, documenting its condition and exact location. Then she just sat there for a while, keeping them company. The cemetery was quiet except for birds and the distant sound of traffic. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. "I'm sorry you had so little time together. I'm sorry the world was so hard. But I found you. Your photograph survived. Your story survived." Back at the Louisiana Historical Society, Margaret began piecing together the broader context of Ruth Williams's life. The 1900 census provided crucial information. She found Ruth living in a small dwelling on St. Anne Street in Trem, listed as Ruth Williams, Negro, female, age 25, laundress, widowed. Widowed. So there had been a husband, Emily's father, though he hadn't been recorded at Emily's baptism. Margaret checked death records from 1896 to 1897 and found him. Thomas Williams, Negro, male, age 28, died March 15, 1897. Cause, accident at docks. Emily had been born in June 1897, which meant Ruth had been pregnant when Thomas died. She had been widowed at 22, pregnant, and had raised Emily alone for 7 years working as a laundress, one of the few jobs available to black women at that time, involving exhausting physical labor for minimal pay. Margaret consulted with Dr. Patricia Johnson, a historian specializing in African American life in early 20th century New Orleans. Over coffee, at a cafe near Tulane University, Margaret shared everything she had discovered. Ruth Williams represents thousands of women whose stories we've lost, Dr. Johnson said thoughtfully. Single black mothers in the Jim Crow South had almost no safety net. They worked impossible hours for wages that barely sustained them. And when their children got sick, she paused, emotion crossing her face. They had limited access to medical care, sometimes none at all. A fever that might have been treatable in a white child with access to a private physician could be fatal for a child like Emily. The death record said grief and consumption, Margaret said. Could grief actually have killed her? In a manner of speaking, yes, Dr. Johnson replied. Tuberculosis was rampant in overcrowded, poor neighborhoods. Ruth probably already had it. Many laundresses did, from working in damp conditions with poor ventilation. The stress and grief of losing Emily would have weakened her immune system, accelerated the disease. And then there's the possibility she simply lost the will to fight it. When you've lost everything that matters, when you're exhausted and sick and alone, sometimes people just let go. Margaret thought about the photograph again, about the determination in Ruth's face. She made sure to get that photograph taken. That wasn't giving up. No, Dr. Johnson agreed, that was love. That was her making sure Emily wasn't forgotten. In a society that treated people like her as if they didn't matter, she insisted that her daughter mattered. That photograph was an act of resistance, of dignity, of mother's love asserting itself against a world that wanted to erase them both. Margaret became determined to learn more about Arthur Beaumont, the photographer who had created this lasting memorial for Ruth and Emily. She returned to the archives and found more information about him in the records of the Freedmen's Bureau and in black newspapers from that era. Arthur Beaumont had been born into slavery in Mississippi in 1858. After emancipation, he had made his way to New Orleans and somehow learned photography, possibly as an apprentice to one of the city's established photographers. By 1898, he had opened his own studio, small but significant, serving the African American community of Trem. In an edition of the Southwestern Christian Advocate, a black Methodist newspaper from 1905, Margaret found his obituary. He had died in December 1912 at age 54. The obituary described him as a man of compassion who understood that every life deserved to be remembered, regardless of circumstance or ability to pay. That phrase, regardless of ability to pay, caught Margaret's attention. She went back to Beaumont's ledger page that James had found. Next to Emily's entry, in the margin, was a small notation. No charge. Beaumont had photographed Emily for free. Margaret could picture the scene now with heartbreaking clarity. Ruth, grief-stricken and desperate, somehow learning of Beaumont's studio, perhaps from someone at church, making her way there with Emily's body, or perhaps Beaumont had come to her, bringing his equipment to wherever Ruth was staying. The careful arrangement, Ruth's hands trembling as she dressed Emily in her best dress, Beaumont working with quiet efficiency and compassion, knowing this widow could never afford his services but doing it anyway because it was the right thing to do. And Ruth, sitting beside her daughter's body for the long minutes required for the exposure, holding herself together through sheer force of will, making sure this one image would exist, proof that Emily had lived, had been loved, had mattered. Margaret found herself crying again at her desk. These weren't sad tears exactly, or not only sad, they were tears of recognition, of the human spirit asserting itself against overwhelming odds. Ruth and Arthur Beaumont had created something that had survived 120 years. Not just an image, but a testament to love, dignity, and the insistence that every life has value. The photograph was no longer just a historical artifact to Margaret. It was a sacred object, a piece of someone's heart preserved in silver and paper. Margaret spent 3 months working on Ruth and Emily's story. She wrote a comprehensive article for the Louisiana Historical Quarterly, documenting everything she had discovered. She also created an exhibit at the Louisiana Historical Society titled Seen and Remembered Memorial Photography in African American New Orleans. The photograph of Ruth and Emily was the centerpiece, displayed with proper conservation techniques in a climate-controlled case. Beside it, Margaret placed copies of the records she had found, the death certificates, the church records, the census information, the cemetery plot. She also included historical context about post-mortem photography, about the lives of black laundresses in Jim Crow New Orleans, and about Arthur Beaumont's compassionate work. But Margaret wanted to do more. She contacted a cemetery restoration organization and arranged for Ruth and Emily's grave to be cleaned and properly maintained. A new marker was added alongside the old one, preserving the original stone while ensuring the names would remain legible for future generations. On a bright Saturday morning in June, Emily's birthday month, a small dedication ceremony was held at the cemetery. Sister Marie from St. Augustine Church offered a blessing. Dr. Patricia Johnson spoke about the historical significance of Ruth and Emily's story. And Margaret read from letters that had come in response to the exhibit, from descendants of Arthur Beaumont, from historians, and from ordinary people who had been moved by the photograph. One letter came from an elderly woman named Grace, who lived in Houston but had grown up in Treme. She wrote, "My grandmother used to talk about a Ruth who lived on their street when she was a little girl. She remembered when Ruth died, how the whole neighborhood mourned her because she had been so kind to everyone despite having so little. My grandmother said Ruth used to sit on her step sometimes, holding a photograph and crying. Now I know what photograph she was holding." After the ceremony, Margaret stood alone at the grave for a few minutes. She had brought fresh flowers, lilies and roses, white and yellow, the colors of hope and remembrance. "Your story is known now," Margaret said quietly. "People see you. They understand what you endured, what you survived, how much you loved. Emily isn't forgotten. You aren't forgotten. That photograph you fought to have made. It did exactly what you hoped. It kept her alive. It kept both of you alive." A breeze moved through the cemetery, rustling the trees. Margaret liked to think it was acknowledgement, acceptance. She had done what she could. She had taken a photograph found in a dusty antique shop and restored it to its full context and meaning. The exhibit ran for 6 months and was one of the most visited in the Historical Society's recent history. People stood in front of Ruth and Emily's photograph for long minutes, many with tears in their eyes. They saw not just death, but love. Not just loss, but dignity. Not just history, but humanity. Margaret kept a copy of the photograph in her office. Sometimes, when she was overwhelmed by the scope of historical loss, by the countless stories that would never be recovered, she would look at it and remember. Every person matters. Every life deserves to be seen and remembered. And sometimes, if you look closely enough, if you care enough, you can bridge the gap between past and present and give voice to those who were silenced. Ruth Williams and her daughter Emily were no longer just names in forgotten records or anonymous faces in an old photograph. They were known. They were remembered. They were loved, not just by each other in their brief time together, but by everyone who now encountered their story and was changed by it. In the hand that revealed the shocking truth, held carefully in place for a photograph that would outlast both their lives, there was a message that transcended death itself. Love persists. Memory endures. We are here. We matter. We were here.